So this is probably going to be one of my first talk that's not going to be very much technical. I am going to show a few cases of how we can improve our developer experience and define what developer experience is. And as well, I have some bonus slide for the people that still work with ob.i here. You still work with ob.i, right? Good. My name is Michael. I'm actually worked at Outbrain a few years ago. Had a team called Infra back then. Actually, it was even called DevOps team very, very long back then. But then we changed it to Infra not to make confusions. I work here on some of the tools you're familiar, like ob.i and the metrics lib and many of the annoying libraries you must work in today and composable features that some of you probably really much love. I want to talk today about developer experience. So when we're looking at any type of product, even the widget here, right? Always think about the user experience. We always think about how it's going to look, how the behavior of it going to sound. Does the user going to press on the image because the image is big enough? Does the user going to press on the recommendation because the title looks good enough? You're working in this company, you know how much data this company puts to produce the recommendations we're doing, to basically provide a good user experience for people to click on the recommendations. But then we have the developer experience concept. So we're as developers, we're producing software, but we're also using software. Maybe our IntelliJ, maybe some other tools, maybe the terminal, and we not always think about our own experience in that part because we're as well users that using other tools. And in this talk, I'd like to try to define what's a proper developer experience looking like, how would you be able to achieve a good one, and set of examples just to show you what I'm actually meaning. I was trying to find a quote that defines the best way I could describe developer experience. And developer experience describes the interaction and feeling that a developer has when working with a body of code in order to meet a specific objective, right? So, for example, I assume all of you writing in Java, right? Raise your hands if you ever written in Java 7. Good, at least few of those. So back then, if you remember, like for example, Java 7, we had the datetime API. If you actually remember the datetime API, you remember how horrible it was to work in with that, parsing, creating the dates, just, I'm not going to use the words piece of crap, but yeah, piece of crap. And people were kind of annoyed because of the experience we tried to achieve. And then Joda time came and tried to show how the API looks like. And that's one of example of developer experience. So the Java 7 datetime API quite solved the issue, but in such overhead and such complexity that one would be annoyed writing and using that. And then like there's the concept of a user interface is like a joke. If you have to explain it, it's not that good, right? You don't have to explain user interface. And yet for the developer experience part, it's not always accurate, right? So sure, we want to have intuitive tools. We want to have simple UI. We want to have basic abstractions that everybody can understand. And yet, for us, the concept of intuitive interfaces may be a bit different. For example, any project you like really much have no documentation? Is there one project you use on your day-to-day and have zero documentation? I assume not, because that's part of the developer experience we're trying to achieve. Last time you wrote any public-facing API, have you used Swagger? Perhaps yes, right? Just to provide a simple usage for your API for everybody to be able to consume it properly. So for me, developer experience is certain mindset, right? So there's many companies that after a certain scale creating a team called developer experience, so creating a certain people that labeled by doing that. And I think that's something broader than that. And there's certain aspect and concept that we can just think and observe in many senses when we are writing our own tools. It's not something that is specific profession. It's something that each of us could just put a bit of mind when we're developing the next API, the next library, the next framework, or even just the CLI tool. So, what does the whole thing, as I said, means? I try to gather certain key aspects or concepts of how a proper developer experience would look like. And I want to focus on main three pillars: the accessibility, clarity, and trustability. So accessibility, for me, it's the interfaces, and I'll describe every one of those in further slides, and the self-serve. So in a sense, accessibility for me is the ability to use the tool that's been provided to me as a developer within a manner that I can easily consume, easily use, and I'm not being dependent on anyone. I just have full self-serve. Clarity. We as engineers, we like metrics, we like logs, we like to understand what's going on. And we hate that we have a tool that just doesn't tell us what's going on behind. And part of that is going to improve how we react to the tools we're using and how much we love them. And the latter, which is kind of combination of everything that's going to be said now, trustability. When we're creating those tools, the important key factor for me is to us to trust the tool. For example, how many of you use Eclipse today? Please don't raise hands. That was what I was expecting to. We don't trust the tools. Sure, there was a time that Eclipse was great, but we have IntelliJ. We have amazing tools, amazing IDs right now. So we do care about the trust. When we use the tools as developer, one of the most important things for us to know, we can rely on the tool and we can trust to do our day-to-day work. So interfaces, I'll try to walk through kind of certain types of interfaces and how we could just simply improve them. So API, right? And just ask yourself, I'm putting here random questions that came out of my mind, but I'm trying to create you a certain thinking framework when you're approaching your next API. So for example, how to discover endpoints, right? So if I'm creating internal service in the company and I have other groups of developers that are going to consume it, how they're going to discover which endpoints do I have? How to interact with the endpoints, right? So do I accept some basic auth? Do I accept some specific method type? Do I need certain headers to work with it? How do I interact with the endpoint? What's the payload that the endpoint accepts? And how the response going to look like? It's important questions to think of. And how to react to failures, right? So it's not always successful cases. It's not always that we send in some API call and we're going to get 200 OK with the JSON we needed. Many of the times we're failing on certain edge cases. Maybe the JSON was incorrect. Maybe there's certain downtime of one of the backends of the service. How we do propagate properly those errors? So for those questions specifically, but again, thinking mindset, that's the main thing here. For example, leverage your protocol semantics. Many of the people don't really understand how powerful HTTP is. You have so many concepts with this simple protocol. You have the ability to describe your errors with wonderful set of status codes. You have the ability to parse context via headers. You have so many concepts that you can leverage easily on the protocol itself to enhance the user experience and not creating something out of the blue. Don't try to assume context, like don't assume prior knowledge. It's the worst thing we're doing as developers. For us, it's clear what we're trying to achieve, right? So I don't know, if I'm writing a log parser, maybe for me it's intuitive that the basic log gonna be JSON, but who says that's gonna be always the case? We need to understand that our implicit decision or implicit knowledge blocks us from creating a good experience because the user, which gonna be developer in this case, not necessarily gonna have the same environment or the same starting point to use that tool. And lastly, just keep it interactive. Really, it's so important. Especially with APIs, we have today Swagger and OpenAPI and dozens of wonderful tools to expose the API and document our API properly. And it's not only even just the documentation and showing that. One of the key features for me in Swagger that I can just go to the page, press on submit a request, and get a response directly on the same page. So I'm getting interactive experience with my endpoints even before I started implementing them, which is amazing. And again, that whole thing basically increases the adoption of the APIs you're trying to create. Really, learn about HTTP. Simple protocol, not that tough. You're doing web services here. You should be familiar way more with the protocol you're using behind the scenes. So CLI. Any one of you written recently any CLI tool, perhaps? Raise hands. Nobody. Never mind. When you're going to write your next CLI tool, ask yourself a few questions. Where it's going to be executed? On my laptop, on some CI, where it's going to happen? What's the environment requirements? If I'm, I don't know, writing in Python, does everybody have the same Python version? Perhaps yes, perhaps no. And how to start using that? So just to answer those questions, and again, as a sample questions, think that in the case of where it's going to be executed, we can easily create a single executable binary, right? Let's assume if we're compiling with Golang, our output going to be a single exec. It's way more powerful to provide a tool that's self-contained rather a tool that requires local dependencies. Means that if you're now writing a tool, again, sorry for the Python example, but I'm going to stick with that. And I'm writing something in Python 3.7, and my developers are still stuck with Python 2.7 that requires them either to upgrade the Python, modify local dependencies, and it creates bad experience in a nutshell. And again, we were trying to achieve a high adaptation with our tools. Really distinguish between interactive shells or interactive interfaces comparing to non-one. So for example, again, going back to the CLI tool, when I'm writing on my laptop and I'm opening my terminal, I probably would like to interact with the CLI I'm working in. Means that I would like to open the prompt and get certain questions and just starting playing with that. Rather, when you're in CI or you're some non-interactive environment, that's the worst thing you could do, because then the user of the CI that's going to implement your CLI within will have to start piping certain outputs and pre-appending them to your CLI. Basically, if you're reading, sorry for the technical part, reading std-in and you're trying to append it, you need to start piping everything, and it makes your CI to look really bad. So think of that for the CI, maybe just arguments to the CLI would be the better approach, and you don't have to pass anything more. And again, this mindset that you understand how it's going to be used, where it's going to be used, it just helps you to provide better experience in each part of the spaces you're going to use and adopt the tool. And please, if you're writing any CLI tool, just do -- help. So easy, so convenient. I see a pattern of many people, again, assuming that their CLI tool is intuitive enough, and that's false assumption. Usually, our user won't understand properly immediately how to use your CLI tool. Just add -- help, nothing big, and it could save so many times and so many hours of debugging. For example, HTTP PI, I think it's simple prompt that you're setting up the domain. You're within an interactive prompt now that you're basically defining the operation you like. So for example, this interface would be really horrible in CI, because in CI, in order to pass those fields, I would have again to append them via std-in. But otherwise, like in CI, we could use just curl. And curl on our terminal would be more complicated than that, if that makes sense to you. There's nothing much to say about UI, right? Just make it pretty, really. Like, whereas developers always think that, yeah, UI is not really important, we can do many other things. But yeah, UI is still important. As much as we enjoy going to Gmail or any other product that we think looks good, why our internal tools have to feel bad? Why internal tools have to feel like we implemented some Bootstrap 3.0 since 2006 and we're stuck with some Web 1.0 experience? Just put a bit more effort in the UI, and I assure you, your developer is going to enjoy way much the tool you're trying to provide. And lastly, as a pro tip, think of that in certain scales and in certain cases. ID plugin is also quite neat, right? So our main interface for engineers is our ID. We're working mostly within our IntelliJ. And the context switch of moving between that window to Diploma or any other tools you're using internally is annoying, right? Why I need to write my code in my ID, then go to TeamCity to build and create my artifact, then go to the deployment system. So many interfaces. If you could just leverage the concept of ID plugin and provide as much as the tools you have as an ID interface, ID plugin interface, that could again reduce your developer pains and increase the happiness of the tools you're trying to provide. Great. Nothing to tell about Selfserve much. It clears to everybody. Make sure you have documentation. Think about how the user, for example, in the CLI case, is going to install it, right? So if you have brew, apt, yum, just leverage that. Don't overthink that. It's going to simplify the bootstrapping and the beginning usage. And for me, the most important fact is that don't try to put some magic. Don't try to hide it with black boxes. Just give maximum control, right? I would like to know what the tool's doing behind the scenes as much as I can. That gives me back control as a developer. So if I'm trying to hide everything I'm doing and encapsulate in some big try-catch and returning some big error, yes, something happened and something not, that gives lacks of control. And we're going back to the trustability. If I don't know what happens with my tool, how can I really trust it? There's a really cool project called Backstage of Spotify. If you're not familiar, I'm suggesting you to check. They basically took the whole concept of developer portal and implemented that as an open source platform. They actually took the concept of Selfserve and took it like 5 steps forwards to create a simple UI to discover all of the services, the catalogs you have, the builds, just to have one place that contains all of the relevant data for the day-to-day development. So there's nothing, again, much to say about visibility. For me, it's mainly 2 things. Have clear error messages and collect metrics and logs. That's all. Like, this is one of the most annoying errors I ever saw. So 500 internal server error. Yes, for public-facing APIs, that's the correct error. You don't want to share the internal details of your service. But when I'm speaking internally, within my own VPC or within my own network, with RPC or any type of other communication protocol style, why do I need to get this type of error? Just give me context. Hey, I failed to serve your request because my database failed to answer your query or something like that. Give that context, and that makes the experience of the failure just to be just a tiny bit better when the developer understands why his request failed, rather than just going to you as the service owners and asking, hey, I got 500, please help me. And trust me, back then in Outbrain, we had so much of those types of emails, and it didn't help to anyone. It's another example that helps just to explain a bit better what I'm trying to say. So this is some random API that I found on the web that failed the request with 400, but as well said, hey, the product is already available to sell. Just clear, simple. And by the way, this is also a bad example, because this is example that is human readable when we're debugging with our eyes. But when we're gonna handle programmatically certain issues, doing string compare with that string gonna be really annoying, right? So add just another field of status code or error code or some enab the developer can properly handle within their code. Transparency. This, again, provides clear and verbose logs. Don't try to hide anything. Dump all the data you have. You failed to access the network, share it. You had weird exception going to the file system, share it. You tried to serialize some JSON and you failed, share it. Don't worry. Don't try to think of not overwhelming your user. If your user wants to understand what's going behind the scenes, give them the ability, again, if they want. Prefer to avoid the black box approach, as I said. Just make a tool that is clear, understandable, and I know how to consume it behind the scenes. And try to be minded to share things that are developer human readable. So as the arrow I show you back then, just a slide before, that's a good example of something that anyone can understand. And it's so much meaningful than those random exceptions that we've seen, null pointer exception at some random stack trace that nobody ever gonna understand or read it. It doesn't help anyone. You're familiar with Terraform? Anyone? Great. So Terraform is infrastructure as a code tool, and I show in this example because Terraform shows a good example of how transparency could look like. Terraform basically describes how your cloud resources, for example, are going to be provisioned. And you can just apply a function called plan in Terraform, and it shows you exactly what it's going to do. So that gives trust in the tool, and I know exactly what's going to be changed, what's going to happen, without worrying too much that my tool going to do some random things behind the scenes. Lastly, for me again, I know I said it a few times, but I'm going to repeat it one last time. Do I trust the tool? When we're trying to build anything, and I know I'm saying tool for the examples many times, but it can be anything. It's from the API you're exposing to the developers. It's to the framework you internally develop. It could be the CLI tool you're trying to achieve. It could be anything that the developer gonna consume. Always think how your user gonna react in case of failures. Always think how user gonna react in case of unexpected things. They want to have stability. They want to know that we're trusting the tool. As much as you're really trusting IntelliJ, right? You're going to use IntelliJ. You have like high trust in the product. You're not going to change it back to Eclipse because we had one exception. But you still know you can rely on the tool. Just make sure you have the critical flows steady, stable, and deliver the functionality. That's all. Prefer do less. It's not something to be ashamed. I see many tools that are trying to achieve so much functionality, but they suck at most of it. Prefer to just have less and make it better as you can. For example, this shows exactly lack of trust, right? 3 billion devices for like last 15 years or so. Nobody already trusts Java as end users. Maybe not for us as developers, but think of the average user that's gonna install the JVM and is gonna see that window. Doesn't help anyhow to the trust of the tool. And all of the aspects that I mentioned, basically creating a good developer experience. But more of that, it improves your velocity. And that's a main point to think of. When I'm trying to onboard new developers to my team, and I have no documentation of the code, I have no basic ability to bootstrap a skeleton of a service, I don't know how to build or deploy that, I'm creating overhead of that onboarding, and I'm reducing my velocity over time. Think of that, I'm trying to write same API time to time, and I don't have any common tools that are gonna facilitate me. I'm wasting time, I'm reducing my velocity. Try always to think that the tools and the APIs you're providing, for example, internally, you still have the SW infra libraries, I hope so, right? Cool. So think of the metrics library. If we wouldn't have the metrics library here, how much time we would spend just understanding what's going on with our production? And if each of one of you would implement their own metrics library, then the company would have literally zero standard on how we're trying to create and produce metrics, which would again create complexity and reduce the velocity. So I like to use this screenshot, right? I think it's clear to everybody. We like metrics, we like to monitor, and I took a random screenshot of some dashboard I found that shows basically the SLOs and quality of service of some random software. We can see here the uptime, the latency, the errors, many, many interesting data. What we don't really see here. What's the user metrics, right? So we know that the system is functioning. We know that we're meeting our SLAs, and we know that our platform is in uptime of 5 nines. Amazing. But how do we know our users actually enjoy the product? This is a screenshot from Amplitude. And it's funny that most of the developers really know the Grafana dashboards, but don't really know how the users actually using their product. So think of the metrics you're collecting. The metrics you're collecting shouldn't be just technical ones, right? So it's obvious that we're gonna collect the latency of our rate points. It's obvious that we're gonna collect the error count of how much certain exception happened. But what happens on soft errors means that, for example, I'm having an API that accepts certain JSON, and I'm failing to parse the JSON because the user sent me invalid JSON. Does that a metric that worth to measure? Probably yes, because that defines that your user not really understand how to use your API, and it gives you strong insight on how you can again improve the experience of your product. Try to think of which user metrics you'd like to collect next time, which are not only your service metrics and your operational metrics. And both of them create just the success of the adaptation. If we know to measure the operational efficiency of our service, but as well we know to understand the behavior and the usage of our users, we're creating a holistic experience that both meets the SLAs, but as well as provides the value we try to achieve from the beginning. So I try to summarize what I said, and I think that's the main keys for me. Always be minded to the interface and interaction. Think how I'm gonna use the product, how I'm gonna interact, and which type of interfaces I'm exposed. Just collect data. Really doesn't cost you much. We have so many storage now. It costs practically nothing. Just have an extra metric or have an extra log that describes what's going on. That's gonna help you to analyze your user's behavior way better. For example, by the way, Trace ID. Simple thing you already can do on your public-facing services, and you're going to understand internally what the user done and to retrace back their errors they received. Drink your own champagne. Like, try to use the things you're developing. Don't assume that you know exactly what the user going to want. If you're writing certain API, use it at least once, whether it's in your test, it's in your CI, or you actually have a use case for the endpoint. Feel it, understand how your developers and your user gonna use it. Otherwise, you just have zero clue what they're gonna feel when they're gonna start using your tools. Optimize for trust. Again, think always, does my clients, which are developers, have trust in my tool? Think of the deployment system. If you wouldn't have trust in your deployment system, you would probably deploy once a week or once or twice a week, which would horribly impact on your velocity. Think that today you're trusting your deployment tool gives you the ability to deploy 10 times, 20 times a day, which is amazing. It helps you to increase your productivity, and it helps you to achieve your objective way faster. But if you wouldn't trust the tool, the whole story would be completely different. And accessibility, always be minded how they're going to implement it, and always be minded how to make it accessible to everybody. If there's need for CLI, amazing. If it's need for UI, great. Just think of how to increase the adoption, because it's really important. So a few examples, and I'm going to finish this talk. I found the Developer Center of Outbrain. Any one of you familiar with this page? Yeah, of course, Oriel. But it's really, if you're just gonna look for Outbrain API, that's the first page you're gonna see. Do you think that's create a good developer experience? Anybody? Raise your hand if yes. I didn't expect so. Great. But then I found another page. Engage Reports API, and they use you a tool that you actually, I'm looking at you, Oriel, but I know it's not you. Actually, you can engage here with the endpoints and feel how they're going to behave. And on this page, you have the status codes and how it's going to behave and the payload, which is amazing. We gained interactivity with their endpoints. But then I went a bit further and I check out the comments on Google Groups. And I see someone saying, hey, I'm trying to use the API, I'm getting user not authorized. And then I scroll down to find the answer of your publisher defined time zone in EST. Bottom line is, you see there's no connection, right, between the actual error to what actually happened. I'm not blaming anyone here. That's why it censored the names here. I'm just trying to show you an example of how intuitive error message could save that client to even write the a priori message and not even talking with your support team. HTTP just as another example, it's really nice too. If you use in curl on your local terminal, try to use HTTP once. Saves so much time, so much intuitive to work with rather than curl. And it could save you hours, I think, hours in your just day-to-day debugging. And lastly, example from our own product. So I'm working today in a company called Quali, and we're providing tools for developers to spin up environments on demand. And that's one of the UI screenshots we have in the product. See here that in the scope of your environment, which is just random description of the environment, you have most of the context you need here. You're able to troubleshoot, you're able to understand how the infrastructure provisioned, you have the parameters, you have the quick links. Well, I'm showing you that just to show you an example of a simple UI that gives you much context you need to start and understand how to work with the tool. And only in this question, you have so much data points to understand what happened with your environment, how to access it, and how to use it. Many more examples. I can talk with you until tomorrow. For me, the Java 7 datetime API is the most brilliant one. And everything I told here was kind of in abstract. I didn't set specifically how you should, in which cases you should implement those concepts. And yet, even in the simple things, when you're just creating your next public method, some library that your internal developer is going to interact, just think of the signature of the exceptions. Think of whether you accept them to try and catch, or maybe you're going to return a try construct for them to basically have some flat map and other type of interface. So much examples. Just be minded next time you're doing any tool. Developers are user. I'm not sharing anything you didn't expect. Always be minded to that. There's a few resources, and thank you. One bonus slide for the people that actually still write in async code. So one of the annoying thing is that when you're writing a blocking code in your event loop and you don't understand why your application just stops working, Vertex created a really neat tool called thread check blocker, and it just shows you a log when one of your threads in the event loop got stuck. So that's also a really cool experience in a low-level developer experience. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Any questions for Michael?
Yes. Who raise your hands? Talk with me. So if I get you right, assuming your user doesn't have network connectivity or it's not connected to your VPN, how do you collect that user behavior? So there's two concepts for that. The simple one, just create a local files that gonna trace all the logs you need. And once the user gonna have again connection to your VPN and to your corporate network, just do like once in a while dump to those logs and submit them. So you're still collecting them just on your local file system, and at a certain point in time, you flash it back. The other concept, which I personally less like, is just trying and repeat, submit and submit, which is horrible. You're again just stuck in this CLI tool. Prefer the first one. Yes? So the question was, I was mentioning soft errors and different errors. Which tools am I using to achieve that mission, right? There's not much tools actually I'm using that. It's just a philosophy or thinking framework that I'm doing. So I'm always thinking, if I was the user and I would get the error message, what would I understand from that? And when I see an error message that says nothing, I'm being annoyed, so I'm trying to avoid that. There's just two main concepts I'm doing. One thing is just to write verbose and explain the error message, and the other one attach either status code or enum or like some construct that could also map the error.
Talking about you as the developer of the tool, of the service, for instance, that see this error, like said that there is like wrong JSON.
Got you. It really depends on the case. So there's like volatile errors that could be recoverable. So just a plain retry could solve them. There's fatal errors, like everything that's between the 400 boundaries. If you're gonna repeat the request, nothing gonna happen again. So you need programmatically to know how to handle. But as the service owner, the one that exposed the service, just give you a priori list of the possible status codes and the possible errors, so you as the client would be able to react to them properly. If I got timeout, means that I probably can retry. If I got 500 server error, means that I probably can retry. if I got 401 unauthorized, there's no much meaning of retry. Does that answer a question?
It's more like how to collect from me to get
Collect it?
how to collect those errors.
Ah, cool. So either submit it if you're internal within your internal corporate, just submit it to ELK or any other log collection tool. If you're on the CLI, you just can even submit email, the dumbest thing you could do. Any point to share the data, use it. So it really depends on the context. I personally, even in our own company, there are certain errors that we just submit into the email directly, just to have immediate notification. Does it's the most efficient way? Maybe not, but it was the easiest way for us to implement it back then. Yes. Yes, sorry. So the question was, I saw the Google group communication style, and Jonathan asked me, do you think that maybe Slack or other tool would be a better approach to talk with our users? So I'm saying not necessarily. I would look at tools like Discourse or even Stack Overflow Q&A internal, which are both really great. Discourse is amazing tool because it provides you so many metrics and logs to understand how your user behave, and you have the ability to do gamification, another concept you like to build in a community. Basically, those Google group is just plain Q&A, which is nice, but it doesn't gain engagement with your users, and that's what you're trying to achieve. So find tools that are primarily designed to engage, maybe Discourse, maybe others, but as well, you can also have Slack channel or like basically Slack to interact with your users, but less on, hey, something doesn't work. More on maybe let's think of a new feature, or let's like trying to iterate on something together. For those concepts, I would say, yeah, go with Slack. Answer a question? Thank you. Yeah. And so the question is, how do you maintain your documentation over time, right? So if I'm changing my code, but I haven't changed the Javadoc signature or the public facing API, how it's going to be maintained? So the simplest thing for me, it's actually test. I know it sounds dumb, but like test is also part of the documentation. So usually when you're changing your code, you're probably going to change the test. And as much as you're trying to bound your documentation within the same function, your mind would just go and think, hey, I failed the test, and probably the documentation is just on top of that going to be need to change again. I don't have suggestion to proper tools, sorry for that. It's just like trying to create certain traps that you must to think of them, mindset traps that you must to think of them, rather than some linter or some other tool that I can think of. Because like it's free text, so I'm not sure how you'd be able to match the description. Maybe like BDD style concepts when you just describe in a story plot what you're trying to test, which also creates certain documentation. Then again, thank you very much.